Let's design a VB.NET program that outputs a pyramid like this one. Now, as you can tell that this pyramid has 5 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. Now, that means I know the number of rows I'm going to be displaying. So obviously I'm going to be using a looping construct, and specifically the for to next loop. So I type in the for to next loop syntax. For, give the loop a name. For I is assigned 1 to 5. That means the loop is going to be running from 1 to 5. That is the first time it's running, the value of I will be 1. The second time the value of I will be 2. So obviously when it runs, it then closes with the next. Now this one is an outer loop that controls the number of rows that needs to be output. But then we now need to determine how many stars are printed in each line. In this time, we're going to be printing 1 star, and then the second star, and then the second line we have 2 stars, and then we have 3 stars in the third line. So to do this, we now use an inner loop, which is now a nested loop now, and it becomes for j is starting from 1 up to I. That means the loop is going to be running from 1 up to the current value of the outside loop. So if the outside loop is running for the first time, that means the inner loop will run for 1 time only. Now let's see what happens when the inner loop runs. That's when we print our star, and this is how we print our star. We write console.write, and then we put our star as text in quotes like this. Let's now run through this before we move on to the next section. So we're saying this loop runs for the first time, that is 1. So the value of I will be 1. The inner loop now will then run for the number of times that is represented by the value of I. So j will be running from 1 up to the value of I. So in other words, the first time j will be running 1 time. And then obviously after I've output this one, now notice how I've used the console.write instead of the console.write line. It's because I want these, for the first time, I want the stars to be in 1 line after each run of the loop. So if I use console.write line, I will just have a straight line of the stars. Let's now close this one and display so that we can get to walk through. Now I then type in console.write line. That means after I have the first star like this, I need to move on to the next line. So that's what is being represented by this statement console.write line. And then obviously I then make sure that my screen doesn't disappear, so I use the console.read key. Now let's go through this with some output. You can see for I is running from 1 to 5, right? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. And then we're saying the inner loop now determines the number of stars that are going to be output at each line. So that means for the first time, the loop is running for the first time. So in other words, in this case, we're going to be having 1 star. That is, the loop is only running 1 time, that is 1 to I. Then when that happens, the next loop closes this inner loop, and then when the loop is closed, the inner loop, we now move on to the next line, which is the console.write line, whereby we're now moving to this second line here. And then once we have moved to the second line, we then go back to run the loop for the second time. Now that means the value of I is 2, and the for loop here that is represented by j will be running 2 times. That means it will run the first time, it prints the first star, and then the second time it prints the second star. But because we're using console.write, all the 2 stars are printed on the same line. And then after these 2 stars are printed, we then move on to the next statement, because the loop has become false because it has run up to the number of times represented by the value of I, which is 2. So it means that this loop has become false. So we move on to the console.write line statement, whereby we're now moving to the third row. And then when we are moved to the third row, the loop then goes back and increments to the value of 3. That means our I is 3, and J will be running 3 times, that is from 1 up to the value of I. And in this case, when it runs, it will output 3 times, because it will loop for the first time, output the first star, loop for the second time, output the second star, loop for the third time, output the third star. Now obviously this is what happens with all the other rows until we have 5 stars. So pretty much this is how you design a pyramid like this one. But now let's try to see how we can design something like this. This one is upside down. The concept is the same, but there's some changes that have to be made. Let's start again. So again, I have 5 rows here. Now, unlike the first pyramid, the first row is going to be having 5 stars. So it means that we're not going to be running the for loop only 1 time. So let's see how it's going to be. For I is equals to, or is assigned the value 1 up to, the value 5 up to 1 step 1. That means the first time the loop runs, it's going to be running 5 times, and then the second time it runs 4 times, and then the third time it runs 3 times. Let's represent that with the inner loop, of course. For J is assigned 1 to I. And then obviously we now have our console.write, and then we have our star. Let me write the whole code down, and then we can discuss it. And then I say write console.readQ. Okay, now let's describe what's happening here. Let's run the code and describe what's happening here. Okay, it's step -1. All right. The loop, the first loop, the outer loop, is going to be running 5 times, right? Obviously. But in this case now, it's going to be running 5 times, and then it decrements to run 4 times, and then it decrements to run 3 times, and then it decrements to run 2 times, and then 1 time. Now when this outer loop runs, let's say it has run 5 times. For the 5th time, it will then display the star like this. That means for the 5th time, that is the outermost part of it, it will display 5 stars. It's just a flipping of this. And then when it decrements to run 4 times, it means that J is going to be running from 1 up to I. Now when J runs up to I, it means J is running from 5 up to I. So that means it will now run 5 times to output the first star, the second star, the third star, the fourth star, and then the fifth star. And then after that, obviously, we then move on to the next statement, whereby we are now moving on to the next line represented by this statement console.writeLine. And after that, it means that we're now going back. The loop decrements to 4 because we are saying step minus 1. That means from 5, we're decrementing to 4. Now what happens is this: when we are decrementing to 4, it means that we are focusing on the fourth row, whereby we are expecting 4 stars because it's the fourth row. But then for us to control how many stars are going to be in the second row, it means J is going to be running from 1 up to 4. That means J runs for the first time, outputs the first star. J runs the second time, the third time, and then the fourth time. But J is being controlled by I, so it runs the number of times that are being represented by the value of I, which is 4. And then obviously it moves to the next line, and then we go back. We decrement up to 3, and then we go back, we decrement up to 2, and then we go back, we decrement to 1. And then when we decrement to 1, it means now we have reached this part here. So when it decrements to 1, it then outputs this loop after it prints the final star. But then it goes back to test this condition. This condition has become false because we are only running up to 1. So it then stops, and then we have our 5 rows with these stars upside down. And when you do that, you're done.